At the end of the war, in the spring of 1945, a group of Jewish factory workers who had somehow survived the destruction of European Jewry did a strange and beautiful thing. They took gold, dental gold, pulled from the mouth of one of their own, a man named Simon Jarrett, and they melted it down, and they forged it into a ring. And on the inside of the ring they engraved a line from the Talmud: "Whoever saves one life saves the world entire." And then they gave it to him. Their boss was a member of the Nazi Party. He was an agent of German military intelligence. He was a war profiteer who would come to occupied Poland specifically to get rich, and who had gotten rich using their stolen labor in a factory he had acquired through the machinery of Nazi theft. He was a drinker and a gambler and a serial adulterer who was, at that very moment, cheating on the wife standing beside him. By every conventional measure of character, every category we normally use to sort the good from the bad, this man belonged unambiguously on the wrong side. And these survivors, these people whose entire world had been murdered, gave him a ring made of gold from a fellow prisoner's teeth, and blessed him with the highest praise their tradition contains, because he had, over the previous 2 years, spent his fortune, risked his life, and lied to and bribed and corrupted the entire apparatus of the SS in order to keep roughly 1,200 of them alive. He wept when they gave it to him. His name was Oskar Schindler. And that ring, gold from the mouth of a persecuted man, engraved with a sacred blessing, placed on the finger of a Nazi, holds inside it the entire unbearable paradox that this story is going to try to understand. Because the version of Oskar Schindler most people know is a lie of omission. It is a comforting story, and comfort is exactly the thing that a real reckoning with this man cannot afford. The truth about Oskar Schindler is stranger, harder, and far more important than the hero we have made him into. And it begins with a fact we would rather not sit with. The man who saved 1,200 Jews was not a good man. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the story. The version you know is the redemption arc. It is one of the most famous stories of the 20th century, told in a celebrated novel and an even more celebrated film, and it has a clean and satisfying shape. A charming opportunist, a war profiteer, comes to occupied Poland to exploit the war for personal gain. He staffs his factory with Jewish slave labor because it is cheap, and then slowly, as he witnesses the horror of what is being done to these people, something awakens in him. His conscience stirs, he undergoes a moral conversion, and by the end he has transformed from a shallow profiteer into a selfless hero who sacrifices everything to save lives. Bad man becomes good man. The war reveals the hidden nobility inside the scoundrel. It is a wonderful story, and it is not quite true, not because the facts are wrong, but because the shape is wrong, and the shape is where the meaning lives. Here is the harder thesis, the one this whole piece is going to argue, and it has two halves that fit together like the two faces of that ring. The first half is this: Oskar Schindler did not save 1,200 people despite being a scoundrel. He saved them because he was a scoundrel. The specific qualities that made him a bad man, the boundless charm he used to seduce and manipulate, the total comfort with bribery and lies and the black market, the profiteer's contacts, the gambler's nerve, the absolute absence of respect for rules and laws and authority, were not obstacles he overcame on his way to heroism. They were the tools of the heroism. They were the only tools that worked. In a world where genocide was legal, where mass murder was administered by respectable, rule-following, law-abiding bureaucrats, a genuinely virtuous man would have been powerless. It took a con man to con a genocide. The good, decent, upstanding Germans, the ones who followed the rules, mostly participated or looked away. It was the corrupt one, the operator, the man already inside the machine and already skilled at working it, who could actually reach in and pull people out. And the second half is the tragedy, and it is the reason the title says he died a broken man. Because the exact same qualities that made Schindler the right man for that one moment made him a catastrophe in every other moment. His genius was a genius for chaos, for operating in a world where the normal rules had been suspended and everything was bribery and improvisation and nerve. In a normal world, a peacetime world that rewards prudence, patience, reliability, and honesty, Oskar Schindler could not succeed at anything, and he never did. He was quite literally the right man for a single narrow window of history, and the wrong man for all the rest of his life. He spent his one fortune saving 1,200 people, and then he could never make another, and he died poor and dependent on their charity, a failure at everything except the one impossible thing. To understand both halves, you have to start with the scoundrel, and he was genuinely a scoundrel. Oskar Schindler was born in 1908 in Zwickau, a town in the region of Moravia that was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and would soon become part of Czechoslovakia. A German-speaking Catholic in a place where such distinctions would come to matter enormously. And by the accounts of nearly everyone who knew him, including eventually his own wife, he grew up into a very particular and very recognizable type of man, enormously charming, physically imposing and handsome, tremendous fun to be around, and almost entirely without discipline, scruple, or staying power. He was a drinker, and would remain one his whole life, a prodigious, sociable, functional drinker in an era and a milieu that was close to a professional skill. He was a gambler, and he was, from early in his marriage and for the rest of his life, a compulsive and unrepentant womanizer. He had married a woman named Emilie in 1928, and he betrayed her more or less continuously, fathering children outside the marriage, conducting affairs openly, treating his wife with a casual disregard that she would spend decades quietly enduring, and eventually name for what it was. And in the ordinary business of life, he was a failure. Before the war, Schindler drifted through a series of trades and jobs, selling farm equipment for his father, running a driving school, a variety of ventures, none of which came to much. He had every advantage of charm and none of the underlying qualities that turn charm into durable success. He was the kind of man who could talk his way into anything and out of anything, who lit up a room and left a trail of unpaid debts and disappointed partners and betrayed women behind him. He was, in short, a charming ne'er-do-well, the guy everyone likes and no one should lend money to. This is the raw material. This is who Oskar Schindler was before history handed him his one assignment. And it matters that we are honest about it, because the temptation the redemption arc gives into, is to treat all of this as merely the before of a transformation story, the dark backdrop against which the later light shines brighter. But that is not how it worked. Schindler did not leave these qualities behind when he became a rescuer. He carried every one of them into the rescue and used them. The charm that seduced women seduced SS officers. The comfort with lies and debts and broken rules became the comfort with the bribes and forgeries that saved lives. The man did not change. The situation changed, and it turned out that this particular broken man was, by pure accident, shaped exactly right for it. But first, that same broken man made himself useful to the Reich, because before Oskar Schindler saved anyone, he served the machine that was preparing to murder them all. This is the part of the story that the heroic version tends to hurry past, and we are not going to hurry past it, because it is essential to understanding what kind of man we are actually talking about. In 1936, several years before any of the events he became famous for, Oskar Schindler went to work as a spy. He joined the Abwehr, the intelligence service of the German military, and he became an agent of German expansionism. In the period before Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, Schindler collected intelligence for the Reich, information on railway lines, on troop movements, on the military dispositions of the country he was living in, all of it gathered to serve Germany's plans of conquest. He was, in the most literal sense, a German agent working to undermine Czechoslovakia from within. He was good at it, in the way he was good at most things that involved charm and nerve and no scruples, but not good enough to avoid getting caught. In 1938, Czechoslovak authorities arrested Oskar Schindler on charges of espionage, and he was sentenced to death. He was saved not by any virtue of his own, but by the Munich Agreement, the infamous act of appeasement by which the Western powers handed Germany the Sudetenland, the German-speaking borderlands of Czechoslovakia. With the annexation, Schindler was released from prison, pardoned by the Reich he had served, and he rose in the ranks of the Abwehr. And that same year, 1939, he applied for and received membership in the Nazi Party. Historians generally judge that Schindler joined the party out of pragmatism rather than deep ideological conviction, that the party card was for him a business tool, a passport to opportunity, rather than the expression of a fervent Nazi faith. That is probably true, and it is worth saying, but we should be careful not to let it become an excuse, because it is, in a way, almost worse. A fanatic at least believes in something. Schindler did not agonize over joining the party of a regime that was, by 1939, openly persecuting Jews and preparing for war. He joined it because it was useful. He served the intelligence apparatus of Nazi aggression because it advanced his interests. He was not a true believer. He was something that the modern world produces in enormous quantities, and that is, in its own way, the precondition for every genocide: an opportunist. A man who would work the system whatever the system happened to be, who asked of any arrangement only whether it was good for Oskar Schindler. That is the man who, in September of 1939, followed the German army into conquered Poland to make his fortune off the war. Not a hero in disguise, an opportunist doing exactly what opportunists do. And what he did next, he did for money. When Germany invaded and occupied Poland, it did not merely conquer a country. It set in motion one of the largest campaigns of organized theft in human history: the systematic expropriation of Jewish property, the seizure of Jewish businesses and homes and possessions, the transfer of an entire people's economic life into German hands under the bureaucratic euphemism of Aryanization. A vast quantity of wealth was changing hands by force, and men who were well connected and unscrupulous could get very rich very fast in the churn of it. Oskar Schindler was well connected and unscrupulous. He went to Krakow, the seat of the German occupation administration, and he threw himself into the opportunity. He became active in the black market, and using the network of German officials he cultivated through exactly the kind of liberal bribery and boozy charm he excelled at, he acquired a factory. It is important to be precise about what this factory was, because the honest version of the Schindler story requires looking directly at it. The enamelware factory Schindler took over, which he renamed the Deutsche Emaille-Waren-Fabrik, known as Emaille, was a formerly Jewish-owned business, and it came into his hands through the machinery of Nazi expropriation. He built his enterprise, that is, on the confiscated property of the very people who were being destroyed. And then he staffed it with Jewish slave labor, workers drawn from the Krakow ghetto and later from the Ploshov concentration camp. For a simple and unsentimental reason: Jewish slave labor was the cheapest labor available. It cost him almost nothing. It maximized his profit. Let us sit with this without flinching, because it is the foundation of everything, and the redemption arc cannot bear to look at it. In the first years of the occupation, Oskar Schindler was not saving Jews. He was profiting from their persecution. His fortune, The fortune he would later spend to save them was itself built out of the Holocaust's economics, the stolen factory, the enslaved workers, the whole vast apparatus of dispossession that he plugged himself into and drew wealth from. The man who would become the great rescuer began as a beneficiary. He got rich on the theft and the enslavement of the people whose lives he would eventually buy back. By late 1942, he had hundreds of Jewish workers laboring in his plant, and he was a wealthy man, and there is no evidence that at this stage he intended anything at all beyond continuing to be a wealthy man. This is not a slander. It is the necessary ground of the whole story, because it is what makes what came next so strange and so instructive. The transformation, when it came, did not happen to a hidden saint. It happened to a man who was, at that moment, an active economic participant in the machine of genocide. And it did not happen the way the movies say. There was no single moment of conversion. There was something much murkier, much more human, and much harder to explain, which is exactly why it is worth trying to. Something changed in Oskar Schindler somewhere in the middle of the war. What exactly and why and how completely, these are questions that his own accounts never fully answered, that historians still argue over, and that Schindler himself seems never to have been able to explain even to the people whose lives he saved. And the honesty of this story depends on resisting the urge to make that change cleaner than it was. The catalyst, as best it can be reconstructed, was witnessing the thing itself. Schindler was in a position to see, up close, the machinery of murder as it accelerated. He witnessed the brutality of the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto in 1943, the day the ghetto was emptied by force, its inhabitants driven out, the sick and the slow shot in the streets, families torn apart and shipped to their deaths. He came to know in appalling detail the concentration camp at Plaszow and the sadism of its commandant, a man whose casual, recreational murder of prisoners became one of the defining images of the whole catastrophe. Schindler saw it, not as an abstraction, not as a policy, not as a number in a report, but as specific human beings, some of them his own workers, being tormented and killed in front of him. And something in the charming, corrupt, self-interested opportunist recoiled and would not stop recoiling. But here is where we must be careful, because the film gives us a clean arc, and the truth gives us something messier, and I think more valuable. Schindler did not, at this point, become a good man. He did not renounce his fortune, or quit the party, or stop drinking, or stop cheating on his wife, or stop being, in most of the ordinary dimensions of life, exactly the scoundrel he had always been. What happened was both smaller and stranger than a conversion. He began, alongside all of that, to do a good thing. He started using his factory, his money, and his connections to protect his Jewish workers, to shield them from the deportations, to keep them classified as essential, to pull them out of the path of the murder machine. And he kept doing it. And then he did more of it, and the doing of it gradually became the central project of his life, without his ever, as far as anyone can tell, undergoing the tidy internal transformation the story wants him to give him. This is the first genuinely important thing the real Schindler teaches, and it cuts against a deep assumption we carry. We tend to believe that good actions flow from good character, that you have to become good in order to do good, that the deed is downstream of the soul. Schindler suggests something more unsettling, and in a way more hopeful, that a deeply flawed person, without ceasing to be flawed, can begin doing something extraordinary, for reasons even they cannot fully articulate, and that the goodness of the deed does not require the goodness of the doer. He remained a scoundrel. He simply became a scoundrel who was, for reasons of his own, spending everything he had to keep 1,200 people alive. The two things coexisted in one body, and it turned out that the scoundrel was the part that could actually get the job done. Because now we come to the mechanism, to how Schindler actually saved people. And this is where the whole thesis snaps into focus, because the method was pure scoundrel from beginning to end. Saving Jews inside the Nazi machine was not a matter of nobility. Nobility was useless. It was a matter of corruption, of finding the greedy, the vain, the bribable men who ran the apparatus of murder, and buying them, flattering them, drinking them under the table, and manipulating them into looking the other way. And this was Oskar Schindler's native genius. Everything that had made him a bad man now became a precision instrument for rescue. His charm, the charm that had seduced a string of women and talked his way through 100 failed schemes, he turned on the SS. He became the great host, the supplier of good times, the man who could get you the finest black market cognac and cigarettes and delicacies that no one else could obtain, the genial companion at the officers' table. He cultivated the men who held the power of life and death over his workers, and he corrupted them systematically with luxury and liquor and flattery and, when necessary, women. He built relationships of mutual advantage with monsters, because those relationships were the only currency that could purchase a human life. His comfort with bribery, the comfort that had let him grease his way into a stolen factory, he now deployed on an enormous scale, an escalating scale, because the price of protection kept rising as the war ground on. He paid and paid and paid to keep his workers off the transport lists, to keep his factory classified as essential war production, to buy the small daily mercies and the large existential ones. He lied constantly and expertly, inventing essential skills for workers who had none, fabricating the industrial necessity of people who were on the lists to die, forging and finessing and talking, always talking, with the fluency of a man who had been talking his way through life for 40 years. And his nerve, the gambler's nerve, held through all of it, in a game where the penalty for losing was not bankruptcy, but a bullet. He was operating inside the SS state as a party member and an intelligence asset, which gave him cover, and he spent that cover recklessly, gambling his own safety again and again on the proposition that his usefulness and his connections would protect him. He did not do it alone, and honesty requires naming his indispensable partner, an Jewish accountant named Itzhak Stern, who became Schindler's right hand, and who supplied much of the administrative machinery and, by many accounts, much of the moral steadiness that Schindler's operation ran on. Stern kept the books, managed the lists, and quietly steered his volatile, charming, hard-drinking boss. The rescue was, in truth, a strange collaboration between a Jewish accountant's discipline and a Nazi scoundrel's charm, the one supplying the conscience and the competence, the other supplying the access and the audacity that no righteous man could have possessed. Because that is the thing. A good man, an honest, upstanding, rule-respecting man, could not have done what Schindler did, because the tools required were precisely the tools of dishonesty. To save lives inside that machine, you had to be able to bribe without hesitation, lie without a flicker, corrupt without conscience, and charm a murderer over a glass of cognac. The virtues that we prize in ordinary life, integrity, honesty, respect for authority, playing by the rules, were, inside the death machine, worse than useless. They were disqualifying. The rules were the machine. To respect them was to feed it. Only someone who had spent his whole life breaking rules and working angles and buying people had the skill set that rescue actually demanded. It took a con man to con a genocide. And the tragedy folded inside that truth is that these were the only conditions under which Oskar Schindler's particular gifts had any value at all. If a story like this, a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that goodness under total evil did not look like goodness, is the kind of history you think more people should sit with, take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. Now, the list and the fortune he set on fire to fill it. By the middle of 1944, the war was turning decisively against Germany, and the murder machine, sensing the end, accelerated its work. The SS began shutting down the concentration camps in the east, ahead of the advancing Soviet armies, and deporting the surviving prisoners westward, which, for the Jews of Plaszow and the region, meant deportation towards the death camps, towards Auschwitz, towards the end. And this is the moment of the list. Schindler made a decision that was, on its face, insane for a businessman. He arranged to move his factory west out of Poland to a town called Brundlitz in his native Sudetenland, and to bring his Jewish workers with him, to transfer them as essential labor for a factory that would nominally produce munitions for the German war effort, out of the path of the murder machine and into the relative safety of a plant he controlled. And to do this, he needed a list of names, the names of the people who would be transferred to Brundlitz and thereby, if it worked, saved. The list of roughly 1,200 names has become the sacred center of the legend, and here again the honest version is messier than the myth. The compilation of the list was not the clean, solitary act of moral heroism the film portrays, with Schindler personally dictating the names of the saved. In reality, the list was assembled by several hands under chaotic conditions and was subject to corruption and manipulation. There were people involved in its making who took bribes to add names, and the precise mechanics of who ended up on it and who did not were murkier and more morally ambiguous than a clean tale of one man's benevolence. To be on the list was to live. To be off it was, very likely, to die. And the process that determined which was not pure. None of this diminishes what Schindler did. It humanizes it. Rescue in hell is not clean. It is compromised and partial and shot through with terrible arithmetic, and pretending otherwise dishonors how hard it actually was. What is not in doubt is what the list accomplished and what it cost him. Roughly 1,200 people were transferred to Brunlitz, and when a transport of the women on the list was mistakenly diverted to Auschwitz, when several hundred of Schindler's women ended up inside the most notorious extermination camp in history, on the very edge of death, Schindler did the thing that almost no one in the entire war managed to do. He got them out. Through bribery, through connections, through sheer relentless pressure, he secured the release of a group of women from Auschwitz and brought them to his factory. People did not leave Auschwitz alive in groups. It essentially did not happen. Schindler made it happen with money and nerve. And at Brunlitz, the scoundrel's masterpiece reached its final form. The factory was supposed to be producing munitions for the German army. It produced, deliberately, almost nothing usable. Schindler ran what was essentially an elaborate, sustained act of industrial sabotage, ensuring that the shells his plant turned out were defective, even purchasing finished munitions from other factories to pass off as his own output, so that his uselessness would not be discovered. The factory's real product was not weapons. Its real product was living human beings, 1,200 of them, kept alive, fed with black market food that Schindler bought with his own money, protected from the SS with bribes that Schindler paid out of his own pocket, month after month, as the fortune he had accumulated drained away. By the end of the war, Oskar Schindler had spent everything. The entire fortune he had accumulated, by his own later accounting an enormous sum, on the order of $1 million of the era's money, was gone, poured out on bribes and food and medicine and the daily grinding cost of keeping 1,200 people alive inside a system designed to kill them. The war profiteer had profited enormously, and then he had spent every last mark of it on the people he had once profited from. He ended the war exactly as broke as he had begun it, and 1,200 human beings alive who would otherwise be dead. And then the war ended, and the scoundrel who had made himself indispensable to a genocidal state found that he was now, overnight, a hunted man. Because in May of 1945, Oskar Schindler was, on paper, exactly the kind of person the victorious Allies, and especially the advancing Soviets, were looking to arrest and possibly execute. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He was an agent of German military intelligence. He was a war profiteer who had run a factory on slave labor. Every fact of his official biography marked him as a war criminal. The paper trail of his life told the story of a committed servant of the Reich, and none of it told the story of Brunlitz. So his workers saved him, as he had saved them. They prepared a document, a signed statement, in Hebrew and in German, attesting to what Schindler had actually done, testifying to his rescue of them, so that he could present it to the Allies and prove that the Nazi Party member standing before them was not what his records said he was. They gave him the evidence of his own goodness, because the official record contained only the evidence of his complicity. And they gave him the ring. We began with the ring, and now we are back at the moment it was made. As the war ended and Schindler prepared to flee west ahead of the Red Army, his workers took gold from the dental work of one of their own, Simon Yarrett, and forged it into a band and engraved it with the line from the Talmud, from the tractate that discusses the infinite value of a single human life. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. They put it on the finger of their Nazi savior, and he broke down and wept, and said, by the accounts that survive, that he could have done more, that he could have gotten more money, saved more people, that the ring was a reproach as much as a gift. Consider everything compressed into that object, because it is the whole story in a circle of gold. The Nazis extracted gold from the mouths of the Jews they murdered, pried the fillings from the corpses, melted them into the treasury of the Reich. It was one of the signature obscenities of the Holocaust, the reduction of human beings to a material to be harvested. And here, at the end, Schindler's Jews took that same act and turned it inside out. They took gold from a living man's mouth, freely given, and made it into a blessing, and gave it to the man who had kept them from the ovens. The material of the genocide reclaimed and reforged into gratitude. Gold from the mouth of the persecuted, engraved with the holiest possible praise on the hand of a member of the party that had tried to erase them all. There is no clean moral in that ring. There is only the almost unbearable density of what actually happened, good and evil and profit and rescue and murder and grace, all fused into a single small circle that a broken man wore for the rest of his broken life. Because the rest of his life was in fact broken. Here is the cruelest turn in the whole story. And it is the turn the redemption arc cannot include because it ruins the shape. Oskar Schindler, the man who had performed one of the great feats of individual moral courage of the 20th century, spent the remaining 29 years of his life failing at everything he tried. The pattern that began before the war reasserted itself the instant the war was over, because the war had been the one and only environment in which his gifts were assets rather than liabilities. In peacetime, they were liabilities again. Schindler emerged from the war penniless, the fortune spent, the factory seized by the Soviets who overran it, and he was never able to build another. He sought reimbursement from Jewish organizations for the money he had spent on rescue, and received some help. And then he tried again and again over decades to be a businessman in a world at peace, and he could not do it. In 1949 he emigrated to Argentina and tried farming, raising poultry, then breeding nutria, a large rodent, for its fur. The venture failed. He went bankrupt. In the late 1950s, he left his wife Emily in Argentina, the marriage finally effectively over, though they never divorced, and returned alone to Germany, where he tried again. He bought a cement factory. It went bankrupt. He tried other ventures. They failed. In 1963, he declared bankruptcy. The following year, he had a heart attack and spent a month in the hospital. He ended up living in a small one-room apartment in Frankfurt in genuine poverty, an aging, ailing, dependent man. And this is not a story of bad luck. This is the thesis completing itself. Oskar Schindler was a man whose entire genius was a genius for chaos, for the suspended, lawless, everything is negotiable world of a war, where charm and bribery and nerve and the willingness to break every rule were the master skills. Transplant that man into a normal world, a world of contracts and credit and patient competence, a world that rewards the man who shows up on time and pays his debts and follows the rules and builds slowly, and he is helpless, because he possesses not one of those virtues. The qualities that let him save 1,200 lives were precisely the qualities that guaranteed he would fail at a cement factory. He could talk a murderer out of a killing, but he could not run an honest business, because he had never in his life been able to run an honest anything. He was built for hell, and hell, mercifully, does not last. When it ended, so did his usefulness to the world and to himself. So how did he survive those broken decades? He survived on charity. Specifically, he survived on the charity of the people he had saved. The Schindler Schindler's Jews and their families, scattered now across the world in Israel and America and beyond, never forgot what he had done, and they took care of him. They sent money. They supported the man in the one-room Frankfurt apartment. The people whose lives he had bought with his fortune now kept their savior alive with their own. He lived at the end entirely on the gratitude of the survivors, the ring made literal, year after year, in the form of the checks that paid his rent. There is a person we have not given enough attention to, and she deserves it, because her verdict on Oskar Schindler is the sharpest and truest thing anyone ever said about him: his wife, Emily. She has been badly served by the legend, reduced to a footnote in the story of her famous husband, and that is an injustice, because she was there for all of it, and she was, in her own right, part of the rescue. At Brünlitz, when a transport of prisoners arrived in sealed rail cars, frozen half to death, many already dead, others barely clinging to life, it was Emily Schindler who took charge of caring for them, who organized food and medical care, who nursed the dying, who treated these ruined human beings as human beings. Her role in keeping people alive was real and substantial and largely uncelebrated. She endured Oscar's affairs, his neglect, his abandonment of her in Argentina, and she outlived him by decades, dying in 2001, having spent much of her later life in relative obscurity and, by her own account, some bitterness. And late in her life, Emily Schindler said something about her husband that cuts through the entire mythology with a wife's unsentimental clarity. She observed, in effect, that Oskar had done nothing remarkable before the war and nothing remarkable after it, that in the long arc of his life the whole of his greatness was compressed into those few short years, and that he was fortunate in those years to have encountered the people and the circumstances that summoned out of him qualities that otherwise lay dormant and unused. Sit with the precision of that. It is not a dismissal. She is not saying he did nothing great. She is saying something more exact and more devastating, that his greatness was not a stable feature of his character, but a response to a situation, that the moment called something out of him that no other moment in his life ever called, and that without that specific, terrible, once-in-history situation, Oskar Schindler would have lived and died an unremarkable scoundrel whom no one would ever have heard of. The war did not reveal a hero. The war created the only conditions under which this particular man's peculiar gifts could become heroic. Change the circumstances, and you do not get a hero in a different setting. You get a nobody. He was, Emily understood better than anyone, the right man for exactly one moment, and that moment was a catastrophe, and outside of it, he was simply her charming, faithless, failing husband. And yet, and this is the tension we should hold rather than resolve, the qualities the moment summoned were his. The moment did not invent his courage or his cunning, or the strange, inexplicable current of compassion that overtook the profiteer and would not let him stop. It found them in him. They were dormant, but they were there, in the same man as all the vices, and when the world went to hell, it was those dormant things that woke up and took over. So perhaps the truest thing to say is the hardest thing to say, that Oskar Schindler contained all along both the scoundrel and the savior, and that in ordinary times only the scoundrel ever had anything to do, and it took the worst catastrophe in human history to give the savior a job. Oskar Schindler died on the 9th of October, 1974, of liver failure, the liver of a lifelong drinker finally giving out, in Germany at the age of 66, poor, dependent, his business ventures long since collapsed into ruin. By the ordinary accounting of a life, it was a failure's death. Broke, estranged from his wife, no lasting enterprise to his name, kept alive at the end by other people's charity. The scoundrel's arc had closed exactly where such arcs usually close. But he had made one last request, and in the granting of it the paradox of his whole life resolves into a single permanent image. Oskar Schindler asked to be buried in Jerusalem. And so he was. His body was carried to the Holy City, and he was laid to rest in the Catholic cemetery on Mount Zion, one of the most sacred sites in the world, a hill freighted with the deepest meaning for Jews and Christians alike. And there, in a spot that survivors and their descendants could visit, Oskar Schindler was buried, and he remains to this day the only member of the Nazi Party buried on Mount Zion. On his grave, the German inscription names him for what he became, rather than what he was, the unforgettable rescuer of 1,200 persecuted Jews. The Hebrew names him with the highest honor the Jewish people bestow on a non-Jew who saved Jewish lives, righteous among the nations. And on that grave, in keeping with Jewish tradition, visitors leave stones, not flowers, stones, the enduring marker of remembrance, the sign that someone came and someone remembers. The grave of Oskar Schindler, the Nazi Party member and Abwehr spy and war profiteer, on the holiest hill in Jerusalem, is covered, has been covered for 50 years, in the stones of the people his party tried to exterminate, and of their children, and their children's children. Because the 1,200 he saved did not stay 1,200. They lived, and they married, and they had children, and those children had children, and the descendants of Schindler's Jews now number in the thousands, an entire population of human beings, whole branching families of people who exist because a corrupt, drunken, failing scoundrel spent his fortune and risked his neck to keep their ancestors off the transports. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. He saved 1,200 worlds, and they are still multiplying, and they come to Mount Zion and leave their stones. So, let us return one final time to the thing we cannot make simple. The comforting version of Oskar Schindler, the redemption arc, the war profiteer who discovers his conscience and becomes a hero, is comforting for a specific reason. It tells us that good defeats evil through good character. It reassures us that when the great test comes, it will be the virtuous who pass it, that the line between the people who rescue and the people who murder runs along the same line that separates the good from the bad in ordinary life, that being a decent person is the qualification for heroism. It lets us believe that if we are good, we would have been among the rescuers. The real Schindler tells us something much harder and much more important, and we ignore it at our peril. In the machinery of a modern genocide, the people actually positioned to save lives were, very often, not the saints. The saints, the honest, the upstanding, the rule-following, the respectable, were mostly either feeding the machine or standing frozen beside it, precisely because their virtues gave them no purchase on a system in which the rules themselves were the evil. The people who could reach in and pull others out were, disproportionately, the operators, the ones already inside, already compromised, already fluent in bribery and lies and the working of corrupt systems, because those were the only skills the situation rewarded. It took a scoundrel to beat the scoundrels. It took a man who had spent his whole life breaking rules to break the ultimate rule. And that should trouble us, because it means the qualification for that particular heroism was not goodness at all. It was a specific kind of cunning that most good people do not possess and would be ashamed to. And the second lesson is the one the broken decades teach. Oskar Schindler was proof that a person can be exactly, precisely right for one moment of history and wrong for every other. That the same qualities can be salvation in one context and ruin in another. That a man can pour out a genius the world will never stop being grateful for, and then have absolutely no use for it, or himself, ever again. He was built for the storm, and when the storm passed, he had nowhere to stand. He spent his one fortune buying 1,200 lives, and he was never able to earn another. And he died on the charity of the saved, wearing a ring made of gold from a rescued man's mouth, engraved with a promise he had more than kept. That ring is the truest monument he has. Not the grave, not the inscriptions, not the film, the ring.
Gold that the Nazis would have melted into the Reich's treasury, reclaimed by the persecuted, and given freely to their persecutor's comrade, because he alone among the men of that machine had chosen, for reasons he could never fully name, to save them. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. It was engraved for a scoundrel, and the scoundrel had earned it not by becoming good, but by doing good, which turns out in the end to be the only thing that actually counts. If the idea that goodness under total evil does not look the way we expect, that it can wear the face of a drunk, a profiteer, a party member, a man broken by every ordinary year of his life, is the kind of history that changes how you understand what you thought you already knew, subscribe. These stories are not about heroes and villains. They are about what human beings actually did in the worst place human beings have ever made. And that is where the real history is.